It's an honor for the Center for Latin American Studies to be presenting this event this afternoon. We are very pleased to be able to host it at such a critical moment. I'm going to introduce the moderator of the event, Professor Beatriz Manz, who has spent decades researching issues on the ground in Guatemala. Her book, Paradise in Ashes, a Guatemalan journey of courage, terror, and hope, lays out some of the themes that will also be discussed. So let me turn it over to Beatriz Manz.
Hello, I am very pleased to introduce my colleague, Irma Alicia Velásquez Nimatuj, a fellow anthropologist. Dr. Velásquez is a Quiché Maya from Guatemala who received her PhD in social anthropology from the University of Texas in Austin in 2005. She has held a variety of visiting positions at several universities in the United States. Dr. Velásquez's personal life has been marked by an unrelenting defense of human rights and as an advocate against violence, against racism, and is a strong proponent of social justice. We at the Center for Latin American Studies are very pleased to have Dr. Velásquez speak about a very important and timely topic: trade, improvement, and survival, an indigenous approach to the current immigration crisis. Irma Alicia.
Thank you so much, Beatriz. Thank you. Thank you for your words. Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to thank Professor Harley Schaiken, Director of the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. Also, Julia Beard and Janet Weineman for this invitation. This work was written last year in the context of the migration crisis. Sorry, I want to share my screen with everybody. Okay. Today, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, the migration crisis has deepened, and the reaction and criminalization of migrants continues to increase. For this reason, with very few changes, I share my reflection with you. Okay. I want to start by acknowledging that the reflection on migration and race was a difficult undertaking, since I cannot separate myself from the topic. I am a social anthropologist as well as a journalist, but most of all, I am a Quiché woman from the highlands of Guatemala, a country which has been in the headlines these past years because the recent exodus of millions of migrants and the human policies of family separation promoted by this country from the halls of power, which have caused the deaths and various Guatemalan children of all whom came to diverse indigenous Mayan communities. In other words, for us as an indigenous people, what has been defined as a migration crisis is in fact the continuation of a process of genocide that we see through the destruction of future generations that should take our place. Nevertheless, speaking from my multiple identities, but especially based on my experience as an indigenous Quiche person, it is impossible for me to discuss migration simple as an analytical category, as an exclusively negative or a criminalized process. It is because as an indigenous people of North, Central, or South America, migration historically has not necessity for survival, and it is now due to the pressure of the global economic system. Instead, it was part of a rich process of commerce and intellectual and cultural exchange, which already existed in the pre-Hispanic era and which was radically modified by the beginning of the colonialism 500 years ago, when Hernán Cortés arrived in April 15, 1919 to what is now the port of Veracruz in Mexico. Despite the destructive and brutal impact that took place in many indigenous areas, those exchange circuits managed to survive and remain vibrant until today. In this way, my perspective on migration and race are tied to my personal analysis, which I will share with you this afternoon. As a young girl of 7, already fully incorporated into my family's businesses, I saw migration as a normal in my Quiche world, and they were motivated by commerce, spirituality, religion, or other interests. This commerce has taken place since ancestral times, when today's political borders were bizarre and exceeding civilizations viewed the exchange of people, knowledge, art, goods, or products as a fundamental for their growth and strengthening as people. Indeed, my great-grandparents, great-uncles, and grandparents invest 6 months of the year in those commercial circuits, which allow them to escape forced labor requirements promoted by the Guatemalan state at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. At that time, beginning a merchant was one of the few ways that indigenous men could avoid being swept into the system of forced labor that the white, racist, and conservative Criollo state imposed, and which entire families were obliged to perform. Given this legacy of exploitation that has been omnipresent in the indigenous social memory, I slowly learned that we, as indigenous families and people, should fight to escape exploitative and poorly paid work or servitude. Not only because it was hard, but also because it was profoundly discriminatory. Indigenous men, and particularly indigenous women, were not considered human beings. Rather, they were treated as things. And the majority of the indigenous women were raped by the employers, their employers' children, or other workers. So I understood that migrating for commercial reasons should be done as a means to improve, prepare observers, and return to our places of origin, as dozens of Quiche men did as they sold our region's products in southern Mexico and even Honduras and El Salvador. They return not only with new products, but also with new ideas that they try to put in practice with their family members. This led them to start different factories in the 20th century in the capital and a few other cities in the country's interior. Nevertheless, it was the men who migrated and whose return was celebrated with festivities. At that time, women did not usually migrate. It was commonly through that we had many opportunities to develop as women in our communities as embroiderers, weavers, business owners, service providers, or working in many other activities. Regardless, it was difficult to think that we could achieve the same opportunities beyond our own cultural and communal world because of the violent and brutal racism that we all faced. Therefore, our community represented a cultural shield that protects us from the racism, for the external world that crushed us materially and economically. For that reason, we were taught to remain within because we were safe there. Although in doing so, this means that we as a women live in a system of unequal power relation in which men were in control. Obviously, women always search for ways to violate these power cycles. And in some way, the majority managed to open windows, even though with severe difficulties. I met many of those women as elders, and they are always inspiring examples who always accompany me. Furthermore, that Maya Quiche world in which I grew up was teaching me that other indigenous worlds also migrate, but in different ways. Their migration consisted of hundreds of families from rural areas and poor communities, descending for weeks at a time, who always passed through Quetzaltenango to buy the products that they needed to work in the coffee, cotton, banana, or sugarcane plantations. There was a migration of thousands and thousands that no one saw. I remember them very clearly because they used to buy from my mother's businesses. Their presence meant a good commercial season for us. Among them, all ages traveled, from babies strapped on their mothers' backs to elderly men and women, what the latter appeared to be in a stable condition when they came down to our city. Months later, when they returned to buy more products before returning to their homes in the highlands, they were thinner and their skin had a yellow cast. This was an experience that repeated year after year. I grew up watching how they were transported in trucks and directed by a foreman, many of whom were from the same communities, only to have a few hours to stock up in Quetzaltenango's market before continuing their journey to the Boca Costa and southern coast of Guatemala. In this way, the highland population moved to the lowlands. Years later, I understood the manual labor and its economic contribution when I attended a public college in my country and read the work of academics who theorized the topic of land and the concentration of the resources, like Carlos Figueroa Ibarra, Carlos Guzmán Bockler, Julio Castellanos Cambranes, Humberto Flores Alvarado, Manuel Villacorta, Edelberto Torres Rivas, among others. Later, while still an adolescent, I migrated from my city, Quetzaltenango, to the capital to attend college in the midst of the armed conflict and genocide. I was one of the 3 young Quiche women who had the privilege to go to a public university, and at that time, my parents paid for my education. There were no scholarship, and we did not expect any, since there was no talk of supporting education for Indigenous women. I acknowledge that I was a part of a generation of Quiche youth who traveled to the capital with our family support to prepare ourselves professionally. Back then, we were perhaps some 100 or 150 Quiche students who traveled in order to study all types of majors, from medicine to the social sciences. And we share the common characteristic of being from the Quiche merchant class, owning small or medium-sized businesses that I later wrote about in my book, La Pequeña Burguesía Comercial de Guatemala, Desigualdades de Clase, Raza y Género. This period in which I hid my Quiche identity to survive the war showed me another side of migration, one that afforded us the opportunity to exercise our right to prepare and educate ourselves, while thousands of our brothers and sisters who were just as young were being massacred as part of the scorched earth policy pursued by own states. In college and during my trips to visit my community, I learned about the unstoppable migration of Indigenous communities who were fleeing the repression as best they could. These were the same communities that years before came to families' business to purchase products before heading to the coast to work. Then they stopped cutting the crops and the plantation, and more than 1.5 million fled to their lives. The highlands become desert as a result of the persecution and state genocide against Indigenous women and men. The capital city became a place of refuge, although hostile for thousands of internally displaced people who stayed in spaces not suited for living and joined the statistic of those living in urban poverty and extreme poverty. It was there that the majority of Indigenous women were forced to leave behind their Indigenous clothing, languages, culture, and peoples. In my place of origin, migration due to the persecution was selective, and although state-sponsored terror shocked us, we did not face the massive exodus that was occurring in the rural areas. Likewise, the public university where I was studying, living through exile of deans, professors, staff, and students, from one day to the next, following kidnappings, attacks on campus, persecution, murders, or torture, all those who were considered enemies of the state. Migrating the public university also faced the massive loss of extraordinary generation of thinkers and students. We were left as orphans of academic debates that never came to be. I am part of the generation of university youth that had to prepare itself with what little was left behind in the wake of state brutality. This required hiding the fact that we were university students or indigenous university students, because if we had fully assumed our identities, we would have been condemned to death or exile. Even today, as I'm writing about this period of my life, it is painful for me to remember that it was necessary to flee my country simply for wanting to prepare ourselves academically, or in the case of the faculty, for teaching in a country that fought against knowledge. Generally speaking, discussions in academic circles and analysis deal with the Guatemalan migration on the 1980s, caused by the political violence that I just cited. They also focus on how the hostile and violent spaces of poverty and discrimination in US neighborhoods where Central American refugees fled led to some form gangs to defend themselves. When they were later deported back to their home countries, they gave rise to some of today's most violent criminal groups that have swelled up to 2 or 3 generations of youth. Nevertheless, this analysis is missing from the current US administration political discourse. Instead, migrants today are depicted with racist stereotype as a criminals, traffickers, rapists, among other pejorative labels. However, beyond the bubble of the current administration, the other reason why Guatemalans continue to migrate after the signing of the peace accord in 1996, during a period that was as supposedly democratic, are not generally discussed. And I question the tendency to present migration as a homogeneous category that does not account the complexity of origin, race, ethnicity, history, and the usurpation of resources and territory, to name just a few. Working as a young journalist, I could see the continuity of the migrations. At that time, we lived with the sense of hope that peace accords had brought. But those hopes were dashed when we understood that peace was not on paper. In everyday life, structural conditions began worsening to the extent that people migrated because Guatemala denied its youth spaces to dream and realize their dreams. It was not just the lack of economic opportunities, but also extremely few spaces for art, music, literature, sports, and other human expressions. For example, a specialization in multiple professions were needed but not available. In other words, we did not to have the spaces to give all of ourselves. Therefore, to explore and maximize our potential, we have to leave the country, leaving behind the land we love. Likewise, the youth in the countryside did not have the necessary material condition to study or work in they so desired. It was clear that in Central America, the offerings of neoliberalism and multiculturalism underpinning the region's democratic transitions remained empty promises, unable to provide a dignified life to the citizens of these countries, and the economic conditions that had led to the armed conflicts continue. In fact, they were even worsening in some cases. By 10,000 of the 1.5 million Guatemalan refugees who had fled were in the United States and had established themselves here. Many had legalized their immigration status, and it was these family ties that motivated to those who had remaining behind to come to this country. Thus, another silent exodus began at dawn, during the night or day, every month of the year, as members of every community began to travel north. Most, but not all of these migrants were men, since women of all ages began to migrate in massive numbers, little by little, using their savings, asking family members for loans, selling or buying what properties they had to pay the fees of the famous coyotes or polleros. The men and women who dedicated themselves to guiding migrants from their communities to different cities in the United States. Indeed, traffickers who are now criminalized in public and institutional discourse were esteemed men and women in Guatemalan communities in the 1990s and first years of the 21st century due to their fundamental role in transporting children, parents, spouses, neighborhoods, and anyone else who required their services. Furthermore, they received community members' gratitude because they helped to reunite thousands of separate families, thousands of children who were without their parents. The fact that they performed their work transporting lives with just the promise of their word and no writing proof mean that they played a vital role in the region and communities. For this reason, the fee for their services was considerable, but nothing compared to the extreme cost to cross Central America and Mexico. It was when organized crime revealed its power in Mexico and began to view the thousands of migrants as arms to transport their merchandise, labor to work for them, and the bodies of women to use sexually, that the price of the journey escalated in 2006. The year 2006 was a watershed because the war between the two most powerful Mexican cartels of that moment, the Sinaloa cartel and the Zetas, caused an explosion of violence in urban and rural spaces. Instead of ending the violence, was only increased since then as the cartels have multiplied, strengthened, or weakened. Cartel violence affected the thousands of Central American migrants passing through Mexico, forcing the coyotes to find other transit routes or pay the cartels in order to continue their journey. This phenomenon doubled the price to cross Mexico and came to this country, but it also led to the mass disappearances of thousands of migrants whose mothers, wives, children, and family members are still searching for them in painful caravanas. We should ask why the cartel violence and disappearances have not stopped thousands of Guatemalan, Hondurans, and Salvadoreños, brother and sister, from migrating since 2006. To the contrary, the number has risen. This is due in part to the corruption of the powerful elite who seized our Central American states, turning them into a bounty that allowed legal and illegal economic and political network to strengthen as the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, CICIG documented through its investigation and cases that it helped to bring to court. In a report it presented 1 year ago, the CICIG presented evidence of the different techniques used to transform national budget into bounty for private interests, creating circles in which network members could enrich themselves at the public expenses. This demonstrates that it was not necessary to have relevant knowledge or skill to govern our countries. Neither was it necessary to be a statesman or woman. Rather, a person only needed to be selected by the elites to become the temporary operator, willing to comply with the orders of national and international elite. It is true that the cooptation of our state is a complex historical process that has evolved over time. This is what led the peace accord signed in El Salvador and Guatemala to become a blank check for the legal and illegal elites to empty the national coffers, and for Honduras to descend into one of its darkest and bloodiest stages. As a result, remanences become a lifesaver, keeping afloat the three economies, to such an extreme that today remanences represent between 15 to 20% of this country's GDP. Thanks to the remittances that thousands of women and men send home each month, households in Guatemala have bread, milk, or meat to eat. Remittances made it possible for thousands of children to have shoes, clothing, or an education. In addition, they allow millions of women to decline jobs that impeded them from caring for their children and to invest their time in various businesses. Remittances also achieved access to an education for thousands of youth were able to graduate from high school. The remittances of millions of families in these three countries were crucial in allowing the poor to access decent housing. They also secured clean drinking water, electricity, and other services for thousands of families' homes, as well as dignified health care for the thousands of elderly citizens forgotten by this state. In short, remittances are not simply statistics, they are the model that was preventing our economies from collapsing. In addition, they have enriched commercial banks that benefit from the exchange rates they apply to each family that receive remittances. In other words, remittances have forfeited our country's financial systems thanks to the work that millions of Central America men and women perform, which allows them to send an average 300 per month. Yet, it is the same financial system that denies access to fair credit for the poor. In this sense, the labor of people who are criminalized here as illegals have come to support the social investment and development that our own state were incapable of doing due to corrupt administration of the taxes we always paid. Furthermore, migration in the democratic era was partially instigated by the absence of the state institution in the most remote communities, as well as the capital cities. citizens, because structural and institutional racism ignore and deny the right of indigenous people and the poor. Due to the political and economic chaos in our countries, in part, some youth have joined to the gangs that have currently brought their own brothers and sisters to their knees. Gangs are the fruit of having not invested in Central America's post-war generation. They are also the result of having promoted public policies intended to depoliticize youth who alongside some deportees ended up creating armies of violent youth. Gangs and organized crime groups divide up the region's territories, initiating a new and unrecognized war that ruined the civilian population as occurred during the 1980s. As a consequence of this daily violence, beginning in 2007, hundreds of minors began to migrate, accompanied or unaccompanied. Once again, they silently began to leave their parents, siblings, and family members to avoid taking part in the urban violence. Those children and adolescents left the school, left behind their friends, and began a long journey to save their lives and in the process, their families. Our states did not care about this migration. They ignored it because they were poor children who came from marginal areas or the poorest classes. The majority of the grandchildren of the indigenous families displaced in the 1980s who recollect to the cities to save their lives from the state repression. They winded up living in marginal areas where you either learned to live with the violence or ended up being a part of it. It was not until 7 years later, in 2014, that then President Barack Obama acknowledged the exodus of thousands of Central American minors who arrived at the US-Mexico border seeking for their stories to be heard, for the system to understand the causes and address their needs, respecting their rights while demanding that governments fulfill their mandates. Nevertheless, they ended up locked in the detention centers, in cages or separated from their parents. And when the American people and the international community accepted these violations and did little to stop them, it was a sign that they were not interested in dealing with the root causes of child migration, which in turn, it is a reflection of the social injustice and the voracious economic system in Central America. Migrant boys and girls are the ambassadors who show the richest nation the face of inequality that regional elites maintain. That was an opportunity to address and understand what Indigenous and Afro-Latino have faced. However, it was a lost opportunity that allowed the toxic mixture of injustice to continue fermenting, leading to the massive caravans that we witnessed to leave Honduras and swell with Salvadoreños, Guatemaltecos, and some Mexicanos, who reflect the humanitarian crisis we are submerged in due to the internal and external factors. Among these is the exploitation of natural resources belonging to Indigenous and Afro-Latino people, which are given to transnational companies without consultation, immersing communities in webs of social conflicts, creating an atmosphere of chaos impossible to live in. The exploitation of the resources and territories is crucial to understanding current migratory processes. Today, there are more than 1,000 conflicts related to the exploitation and usurpation of territories used in Guatemala. The companies involved with Russian, US, and Canadian financial banking, among other countries, have exacerbated division within communities, forcing many to flee and migrate. In the past decade, all those who can have fled my country. In fact, the most recent national census presented the last year report that 5 million Guatemalans now live outside of the country. What does this tell us? What even those who are academically trained have migrated to anywhere besides violent Guatemala. In my case, I returned to Guatemala in 2005 with a profound desire to contribute, and it was been difficult. Indeed, the few indigenous women who have traveled abroad and returned to our country have been labeled as a critical and dissident voices. For that reason, our lives have been also complicated in our homelands. When I encounter brothers and sisters here who are making strides in many fields with or without documents, once again, I feel that the market forces have managed to behave our beautiful land, forcing us to join a new migration movement in order to live and continue fighting. In this reflection, I have tried to show the deep roots of indigenous migration with multiple phases: pre-Hispanic exchange, later forced labor, plantation work, escape from political violence, and genocide poverty produced by corrupt and outdated structures. The indigenous phase of migration remains in the present humanitarian crisis, although it is overshadowed by the category of migrant that only acknowledges the act of leaving home as the sole solution to survive poverty rates, reaching more than 60% among the general population and 80% among the indigenous population. These rates, together with the extreme violence of recent years, make it impossible not to choose to migrate, to flee, but we refuse to acknowledge that, like in the 1980s, the majority of those who are currently fleeing Central America are indigenous children, youth, women, and men. This is why the solution to this crisis cannot be masked as a new forms of beneficences, failed to alter the large power structures that have co-opted our countries. In other words, to truly solve the migration crisis, national and international government must decolonize their ways of thinking and acting. By first of all, focusing on humiliating and keying people, on closing and protecting arbitrary borders, the problem only worsens. For that reason, we should focus on decriminalizing migration so that thousands of men and women can return to their different home communities after a lifetime of work. Most of all, because the majority of indigenous people decide to close their cycle of life in the place where they were born, and to rest in the land of their ancestors. This thought makes me think of my mother's young sister, a woman who lived 22 years without papers in Florida, New York, and New Jersey, working since 1967 in sweet shops or getting paid to take care of the elderly, children, or dogs. After working for more than 2 decades, she decided that it's quite time to return to her homeland, to live with her family and invest there. So that was what she did. Like her, the majority of migrants that I know dream of finishing their lives in the land they left behind. I myself, I am a migrant too. I spent part of my life teaching in this country because I don't have the same opportunities in my homeland. I also hold deep affection for this land because it was also where I trained myself and where my daughter grew up and academically prepared herself. After 15 years of studying here, she returned to Guatemala with few options to return to this country due to the eternal and expensive paperwork of the current immigration system. In this sense, my academic and personal experience have taught me that migration is basically a human process that we should not reduce down to a statistics talk of chaos or disaster. Migration is also not only about economics and the earnings that feed the GDP of nations. Most of all, migration is people carrying elements of their cultures that are indispensable for them to survive in a foreign environment that displaces and dehumanizes them. Migration is tied to race and it has different phases. For this reason, the multiplicity of people and words involved cannot and should not be reduced to a single category that is incapable of capturing this internal diversity. In the case of indigenous people, migration has always been a part of their lives, struggles, and escapes. Indigenous people in the Americas have journeyed since long before the European invasion. And those historic economic circuits with modification and new routes remain relevant today. Therefore, we should demand the right to human movement and not allow it to be denied or criminalized. Migration does not produce illegal people because illegality is a term created by those in the power and the market forces that feed off of them. There are people without documents, but they are not illegal. So we must fight to reclaim their presence as a human beings, not as a human beings, and no one is illegal. Migration is not only determined by wars, genocide, and persecution, it is also a symptom of post-conflict eras, filled with profound forms of violence. Central America is an example of this. While it is true that migration is formed by the breaking up of a state, national elite are also responsible and few dare to hold them responsible for it. Migration in Central America region is also being spurred by climate change and transnational capital that seeks to displace individuals, families, and communities from regions rich in natural resources in order to exploit these areas free from social pressure or meaningful accountability. As a result, forced migration is increasingly destabilizing the core of entire communities and people. It is reconfiguring them, and this will create consequences for the future of Indigenous and Afro-Latino people. This is why we should reclaim the right to safe migration for Indigenous people, for the poor, and especially for children and women. The act of migrating safely cannot be the sole right of the rich, white people, and those who control transnational capital. Finally, we do not choose the time we are born into, but if we want, we can find to try and change our era. With this word, I honor all migrant people, all the Indigenous and non-Indigenous women and men who teach us that migration is a journey not only to prove ourselves, but also to share, denounce, and transform the inequalities that we leave behind. Thank you. Maltiosh.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias, Irma Alicia. This was a very, very comprehensive historical overview that is so important to understand the current situation as you laid it out. We have many, many questions. I should mention we have a wide international audience. You mentioned that the current policies of this administration has created I say many, many problems for Central Americans and for migrants and for family separations and for deportations. What would you say, assuming if there were to be a change in an administration in the US in November, or rather January, what would you say is the most crucial policy that a new administration could or should propose for Central America?
Okay, well, Central America is not important for US government. This is true. And US government need to be in control to Central America in the recently times in order to control the migration. But this is in one hand. In the other hand, Central America is important for the natural resources, and many U.S. company has interest in those natural resources in our countries. So I think, Beatriz, it's difficult for us to believe that the U.S. has interest in Central America. But I believe that now with all the pressure inside and outside our countries and the pressure here, from here, it's possible that the new government put the eyes not only in the problems, but they need to put the eyes on the elite that control our countries. Because the elite, the corruption of the elite has provoked a lot of problems in our countries. But US work together with the elite. US, they don't want to exigere to the elites to try to manage our countries in another ways. So for me, one important thing is US need to work and to put the eyes under the elites.
To put some kind of pressure on the elites for some change, I assume.
Absolutely.
Luckily, you covered, your presentation was so comprehensive that many of the questions that we got, you already covered. You mentioned the importance of remittances for communities in Guatemala. What would be the most, in your view, the most detrimental problems that could happen if they are decreased, either because people are deported or something that you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, COVID, if there is a COVID-related unemployment and people cannot send money back, what would be the impact of a serious decrease in remittances?
Mm-hmm. Well, now, I don't know, it's incredible, but now the remittances they are not low in Guatemala. They are higher and higher, especially in this month. This is incredible. This is a good example that how the Guatemalans that live in US are working very hard, and they are supporting their families in Guatemala. The situation in Guatemala is complicated right now. It's very difficult, the situation. All the state is broken, but the remittances are very useful, are key for the economy. So now the remittances are higher. It's incredible. But if it will be changed, I imagine the crisis in Guatemala, it will be a great crisis, especially in the rural areas, because the majority of the population that now live in US, the majority are from the rural communities. So the crisis will be in education, in health, in food, in everyday life.
We have a question here from Jose. He asks, what is the government doing to alleviate the lack of economic opportunities and the crime? I imagine he's talking about Central American governments and especially Guatemala. Is there anything that the government, the current government or recent governments or the elites are prepared to do to alleviate the economic problems of the country as well as the crime?
Well, as I say in the first question, they are part of the problem. Mm. It's the big problem because they are part of the problem. They don't care about the people. They don't care about the problems. They only think in corruption. They only think in businesses, you know? So the national budget is important for them because they have different kinds of business and they need the national budget for those business. So part of the crisis are the government, part of the crisis are the elites. So the situation, they don't have any important policies that we can recognize. You know, the situation is worse. Every new government is worse and worse and worse. This is the reality.
Mm-hmm. We are almost running out of time. There's so many good questions here. One from Andrea. She asks, where do you see immigration 10, 15 years from now?
Well, the immigration now is important. We can see from different phases, but I think the immigration now is more important for Guatemala. Without the people that is outside Guatemala working, Guatemala it will be in very bad situation. I imagine the people will continue migrating because the situation in Guatemala is not good. If we can see the 10 past years, the migration is almost higher and higher and higher. So in 10 years, the people will continue to do the same because they don't have spaces inside Guatemala or inside the communities.
I think the last question is related to COVID, which you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation. How is COVID affecting Guatemala, especially rural communities? And is there a link with deportations from the US? Perhaps people that are deported might be bringing COVID to Guatemala. Is that an issue?
It is an issue. It is an issue, especially in the beginning of the pandemic. It is an issue, and there is a lot of discrimination against them. It was another issue. This is a problematic. And in terms of the health services, there is not health service in the communities. So the people try to solve their own problems with the resources that they have. The budget for the pandemic is not clear. The majority, the people say, is going to the people that work in the government, and there is a lot of corruption around the COVID.
Are the rural communities getting any health protection and hospitalization or other services related to COVID?
Well, the Guatemala has a very few hospitals for the COVID. One in Guatemala, one in Quetzaltenango, and there is I know about those two hospitals, but that's it. So we don't know exactly how many people is infected now. One. The other, we don't know exactly how many people is dying for the COVID. And we don't know exactly how the people is trying to support inside the community. So there is a few information about the COVID. And but Beatriz, the indigenous communities, they are trying to take care of their members. This is important to recognize. If the COVID is not higher in the indigenous communities, it's because they try to support each other. Mm-hmm. They try to use the natural medicine. They have another forms and another way to confront this pandemic. This is important. And the people know a few about this. And the government never recognized this kind of work inside the communities. This is part also of the reality.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Irma Alicia, and I now turn it over to Professor Harley Shaken.
Thank you, Beatriz.
Irma Alicia, I would also like to thank you on behalf of everyone for a superb presentation. You wove together two themes in a very compelling way. First, a failure of elites, economic policies, larger issues such as climate change, with horrific results for Guatemalans, for migrants, in a very real sense for us all. But you did this without sacrificing the humanity, the dreams, the lives of the people whom you were discussing. That was enormously compelling and essential to really understand these themes. You began with two haunting photos of a 7-year-old girl and an 8-year-old boy who died in US detention. Mm-hmm. And the reality is many of those who were put in cages, mm-hmm. some of whom were released, and others who came, are currently performing essential jobs at great risk with which we owe an enormous debt to. These are two fundamentally opposed ideas. We must put the humanity front and center for those who come, for their rights and their hopes, because ultimately they are the dreams of us all. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Harley. Thank you for this invitation, and thank you to the Center of Latin America at Berkeley University. It was an honor for me to be with you. Thank you so much.